The fires had been burning for 3 days. Not the aggressive, consuming fires of the first night. Those had eaten through entire city blocks, jumped streets, turned glass towers into chimneys. These were the stubborn fires, the ones that found pockets of fuel in collapsed basements and underground parking structures and simply refused to finish. They sent columns of black smoke into a sky that had already turned the color of a healing bruise, that particular gray-purple that appears when something has been hit hard enough to bleed beneath the surface. Mark stood in what used to be an intersection. He knew it had been an intersection because he could still see the traffic light. It was lying on its side 30 feet away, partially buried under a slab of fallen concrete, one lens still cycling green at 10-second intervals. Green light. Meaningless. There were no cars. There was nowhere to go. His breathing was audible. He could hear it himself. Shallow, deliberate, the kind of breath a person takes when their ribs have opinions about deeper ones. Each inhale was a negotiation. His left eye tracked the horizon in a slow sweep, the right eye swollen to a slit that showed him the world through a narrow band of bruised purple light. His suit hung off him in strips where it hadn't fused to dried blood, and stopped being a suit and started being evidence. He was standing because the alternative was admitting he might not get back up. Somewhere behind him, 3 blocks east, Adam Eve was propped against the only wall still standing on that side of the street. He'd checked on her 20 minutes ago. She'd looked at him with eyes that were present but distant, the eyes of someone whose body had demanded payment for everything it had just done, and was currently collecting. Her hands were in her lap. She hadn't moved them. He didn't know what to say to her. He didn't know what to say to anyone. The Invincible War was over. Mark turned that phrase over in his head, the way you turn something sharp over in your hand, carefully aware it could cut you. Over. The alternate versions of himself were dead, or imprisoned, or gone, folded back into whatever dimensional wreckage Angstrom Levy's plan had collapsed into. Levy himself he'd won. He looked at the intersection, the buried traffic light, the smoke columns, the absence of everything that should have been here. This was what winning looked like. A civilian picked her way through the rubble 30 meters to his north. A woman, middle-aged, carrying a child on her hip and a plastic bag in her other hand. The child was quiet in the specific way children go quiet when they've exhausted every other option. The woman's eyes found Mark, held for a moment, moved away. She kept walking. She didn't say anything. Mark watched her until she disappeared around a collapsed corner. He turned back to the horizon, catalogued the smoke columns out of habit, tried to assess which fires were structural risks and which were just burning themselves out, found he didn't have the concentration to hold the assessment for more than a few seconds before it dissolved into the general gray static that had been filling the space behind his eyes since. The light changed. Not clouds, not smoke. Something blocked the sun from above, something large, coming down through the upper atmosphere at a speed that was controlled, deliberate. Not a crash, not wreckage falling. A descent with intent behind it. The kind of descent that has a destination. Mark's head came up. His body registered the threat before his mind did. Muscles pulling tight, weight shifting forward onto the balls of his feet, hands dropping slightly from his sides. Every broken rib objected simultaneously. The figure touched down 40 meters away. The impact was precise. A single crack of displaced air, a ring of dust pushed outward from the landing point, and then stillness. The figure straightened to full height and stood there, and Mark processed him in pieces because his brain was still running below capacity. Tall, broader than Nolan. Broader than anyone Mark had ever fought. He wore Viltrumite armor, not the functional, field-worn kind, but something almost formal, dark purple with silver detailing that caught the smoke-filtered light in a way that seemed deliberate. His right arm was flesh, his left arm was not. The cybernetic replacement gleamed at the elbow joint, where organic tissue met machined metal, and it was the size of something that shouldn't be attached to a living body. He looked around at the destroyed city, not with horror, not with the specific nausea of someone seeing mass devastation for the first time. He looked at it the way a wolf looks at a pen with the fence already broken, taking inventory, measuring what remained, deciding where to start. His eyes found Mark, settled, invincible, the figure said. His voice came from somewhere deep, the kind of voice that didn't need to be raised to fill a space. It filled the intersection without effort. I am Conquest. The Viltrumite Empire sent me to finish what your father failed to start. Mark said nothing. He was running what calculations he could manage. Conquest took in the state of him, the torn suit, the swollen eye, the shallow breathing, and his mouth curved. Not with sympathy, with the particular satisfaction of a predator reading prey that has already been run to ground by something else. "Your father's assignment was clear," Conquest said. His tone was level, but underneath its levelness was something that wanted to move. The restraint of a fighter choosing to use words first, not out of preference, but because the words amused him. Subjugation. Preparation. The systematic weakening of this world's defenses, so the Empire could integrate it without effort. He had decades. He looked at the ruins around him, at the smoke columns, at the burned-out infrastructure of a civilization that had survived something terrible and was still on fire. And this is what he left. Chaos. A half-breed child playing hero, an assignment that required a soldier and produced an embarrassment. He took one step forward. The ground registered it. The Invincible War. He said the phrase the way you identify a wound that has gone infected. Not with surprise, with contempt. Alternate versions of yourself, tearing your own world apart. The Empire didn't arrange that particular mess. It's beneath our methodology that you survived it. His eyes moved over the state of Mark's suit, the swollen eye, the too shallow breath. Tells me you're either harder to kill than you look, or you were simply the last one standing when it finished. Another step. I'm here to find out which, and to resolve what your father left unresolved. He stopped. 30 meters. 25. Submit, Conquest said. It wasn't a request, and it wasn't quite an order. It was a statement delivered with the ease of someone who has broken stronger things than what stood in front of him, and didn't feel the need to make a performance of the offer. Pledge full service to the Empire now. Begin the proper subjugation of this population. I'll give you this one chance because Nolan's bloodline has value, even diluted as it is. A pause. His eyes stayed on Mark. I'll be honest with you. I'm hoping you decline. Mark's jaw tightened. He could feel his heartbeat in his eye socket. Could feel the specific rawness of ribs that hadn't fully set. He was trying to calculate how long he could stay airborne in his current condition. And the answer coming back was, not long enough. And if I don't, Mark said, his voice came out steadier than he expected. Then I find out how much of your father is actually in you, Conquest said, before I put this world back at the beginning. He tilted his head slightly. I've done it before. It's not my preference. A prepared world is worth more than a burned one. But burning is available. He took another step. The air above them split open, not an explosion. A pressure event. The sound of something moving through atmosphere at a speed it wasn't built for, decelerating violently, compressing the air in front of it into a wave that Mark felt in his chest before he heard it. Then a second wave, then a third, each one closer, the intervals between them shrinking. Something was coming down fast, coming down hard, killing its velocity at the last possible moment. The air at the impact point went white, compressed atmosphere heating, igniting briefly, a fraction of a second of brightness, and then the ground received it. The crater was 6 feet deep. A ring of cracked pavement spread outward from it in a 5-meter radius, chunks of asphalt lifting and resettling. Dust rose in a column. The figure in the crater straightened slowly, deliberately. The armor was Viltrumite, but field-worn in a way Conquest's wasn't. Functional, scarred, repaired in several places with welds that hadn't been made for aesthetics. The cape was torn at the lower edge. There was a burn along the left forearm that hadn't been there before. His face was drawn in the particular way of someone who has pushed past their body's objections for an extended period and is running on the part of the engine that doesn't show on any gauge. He'd been flying, for a long time, pushing everything he had toward a single destination, and this was where that destination ended. He put his back to Mark. He faced Conquest. He said nothing. Mark stared at the back of his father's head. He had no framework for this. Of all the ways this day could have continued, and he had been braced for most of them, had been half expecting to simply fall over at some point and not get up. This was not something he had considered possible. His father was here, Nolan Grayson, who had left, who had chosen the Empire, who had looked at Mark bleeding in a field and flown away, who had been gone, was here. Mark didn't move, didn't speak. His body had gone very still in the way bodies go still when they've received information that requires all available processing power and can't spare anything for movement. Three beings stood in the ruins of a city. Two of them faced each other across 30 meters of cracked ground. One of them was trying to understand what he was looking at. Nobody moved. Conquest broke the stillness. Not with aggression, with something that landed worse than aggression. His expression shifted. Recognition moved across his face, and behind it, unmistakably, pleasure. The specific pleasure of something unexpected that turns out to be interesting. His mouth curved. "Nolan," he said. The name carried history in it, old history, the kind that accumulates over centuries of shared context. "I thought you were finished with this planet." Conquest's smile stayed where it was. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of someone who has just been handed a mildly diverting problem on an otherwise routine day. The expression of a fighter with thousands of years of context, recognizing a pattern he hadn't expected, and finding it briefly interesting. Before he resolves it, he looked at Nolan the way you look at an opponent you haven't faced in some time. Assessingly. Taking inventory. "I heard about Thraxa," Conquest said. His tone was conversational in the way a blade is flat before you turn it. "Second family, Thraxan mate. Very sentimental. The Grand Regent was not pleased, but I suspect you knew that already." He clasped his hands behind his back. Unhurried. "And then this world. Your original assignment, the one you spent 30 years not completing." His eyes moved briefly to Mark, then back. "I'll admit, when I intercepted your trajectory, I assumed you'd reconsidered. Come back to do the job properly. Spare yourself what's coming." Nolan's back was still to Mark. He turned his head, not toward Conquest, toward his son. Mark looked at him, swollen eye, cracked ribs, a suit that had stopped being a suit 3 days ago. Standing in the middle of a destroyed intersection, holding himself upright through a mechanism that had nothing to do with physical capability. Nolan took in the full picture of his son in the specific way of someone who has been imagining a worst-case scenario for days and is now determining how close reality came to it. Close. The answer was close. Nolan turned back to Conquest. When he spoke, his voice had no performance in it. No weight added for effect. It was simply flat. The flatness of a statement that has been decided so completely that the deciding is finished, and only the saying remains. "Earth is under my protection." A beat. 1 second. 2. Mark is off limits. Conquest was quiet for a moment. The smile didn't disappear exactly. It reconfigured, became something more alert. He worked through what he'd just heard with the visible attention of someone who has received an unexpected answer and is deciding how he feels about it. "You failed your assignment," Conquest said slowly, as though reconstructing the logic aloud. "You abandoned this world. You went to Thraxa, started a secondary life, were subsequently flagged for disciplinary action by the Empire you've served for 2,000 years. He paused. "And now you're here, standing in the ruins of the planet you didn't conquer, issuing declarations." He let that sit for a moment. "Is that an accurate summary?" Nolan didn't answer. He turned to face Conquest fully. His weight shifted. His hands dropped from their neutral position to something lower, something ready. The adjustment was small, and it was everything, the body communicating what the mouth wasn't going to bother with. Conquest watched the shift happen. Read it correctly. His head tilted a few degrees. "You're serious." Nolan said nothing. "You're proposing to physically stand between the Viltrumite Empire and its asset." Conquest's voice had shed the conversational quality. Not hostile yet, but recalibrating. The way a fighter recalibrates when something in front of them turns out to be more interesting than anticipated. "Nolan, you understand what that means. You've been a soldier for 20 centuries. You know exactly what that position commits you to." Still nothing from Nolan. 30 meters away, Mark hadn't moved. He was watching his father's back, watching the set of his shoulders, watching the way Nolan held his ground without explaining himself or qualifying the ground or asking Conquest to consider reason. Just standing there, just meaning it. Mark had spent the last year assembling a picture of his father from wreckage. The Omni-Man he'd grown up with, patient, present, the person who showed up to things, laid against the Viltrumite agent underneath. The being who had killed the original guardians of the globe in an evening and flown away from his bleeding son in a field without looking back. 2 images that didn't resolve into a single person, no matter how long he stared at them. He was looking at a third image now. He didn't know what to do with it yet. His brain noted it, filed it somewhere it couldn't immediately access, and returned to the problem of staying upright. Conquest unclasped his hands. He rolled his shoulders once, the movement of someone setting something aside, clearing space. His cybernetic arm recalibrated with a pneumatic hiss, servos adjusting the joints, cycling through their range of motion and resettling. "You've gone soft, Nolan." He said it without contempt, almost with clinical interest, the tone of a man identifying something he's seen before and finds predictable. "I've seen it before. Extended infiltration assignments. The subject spends enough time among the primitives, starts absorbing their frameworks, their attachments, their fundamental confusion about what strength is for." He looked at Mark briefly, something in his expression that had sharpened where it had previously been dismissive. The half-breed is a symptom. The 30 years were the disease. He took one step forward. The cracked asphalt registered the weight. "I'll make it quick," Conquest said. "For what you were." Nolan glanced back. Just once. Just a look. Mark caught it. His father's eyes finding him for a single second, taking stock of exactly where he was, and what state he was in, and whether he was going to be able to move when he needed to. There was something in it that Mark's exhausted brain processed slowly, turning it over. Not apology exactly, not reassurance. Something more like acknowledgement. "I see you. I know you're there. Stay back." Then Nolan looked forward. His stance finished settling. Weight evenly distributed. Hands at his sides, loose. 2,000 years of muscle memory organizing itself around a geometry that was older than most human civilizations. Conquest charged. He crossed the 30 meters in a fraction of a second. Not flight, just speed, ground-level acceleration that turned him into a thing shaped like a man and moving like a projectile. The air pressure ahead of him pushed outward in a visible wave. A chunk of loose concrete skittered sideways across the asphalt without being touched. Nolan moved, not backward, not to the side. He moved into it, stepped into the charge at an angle, not dead on, using the geometry of Conquest's trajectory against its own momentum. His right hand caught Conquest's leading arm. His left forearm came up against Conquest's shoulder, and he turned, redirecting the charge rather than absorbing it, spinning Conquest's vector 15 degrees off its original line. Conquest hit the building behind where Nolan had been standing instead of Nolan. The building, which had already been compromised by 3 days of structural trauma, lost its northeast corner. A cascade of concrete came down in a sustained roar. Dust erupted outward in a white cloud. Mark didn't move. He tracked the cloud, watching for shapes in it. Conquest came out of the dust moving, already orienting, already recalibrating. He looked at the building, then at Nolan, who had repositioned 12 meters to the left, and was watching him with the specific attention of someone who is not surprised by what just happened because they planned for it. Something crossed Conquest's face. It wasn't frustration. It was the expression of a very old predator encountering something that required a second look, and finding, beneath the requirement, the first flicker of genuine interest. Conquest said. He attacked again. This time he went aerial, up 10 meters, then down, changing his angle of approach, coming from above rather than horizontal. The descent was fast. The impact radius when he landed would be significant. Nolan went up to meet him. They hit each other in the air 12 meters above the street. The shock wave came down like a physical thing. Mark felt it in his chest, felt it in his damaged ribs, felt it push him back a half step. 2 car husks that had been resting against each other toppled. The traffic light, which had been cycling green every 10 seconds since Mark arrived, finally went dark. The 2 Viltrumites separated, repositioned, came at each other again. Mark tracked them with his good eye, watched his father take the aerial exchange and not get destroyed by it. Not winning, not close to winning, but staying in it, using angles, using the 3-dimensional space, making Conquest turn, making him track, making him work for every exchange, buying time, buying something. Mark's hands had formed fists at some point without him deciding to do it. He noticed this and didn't uncurl them. His body was making decisions independent of his conscious mind, which was still somewhere back at Nolan as here. Nolan came back, turning that fact over and over, without being able to get past it. The 2 figures crashed down to street level again, 50 meters north of where they'd started. A section of elevated highway that had survived the Invincible War did not survive this. The support columns gave way and a 40-meter section of roadway came down with a sound like the end of something. Dust rolled south toward Mark in a slow wave. He stood in it, and didn't move. Somewhere, in the settling debris, someone was getting up. Both of them, it turned out. Both of them rising from the rubble at different points, both of them moving, both of them continuing. Mark watched his father fight. He watched the choices Nolan made, the deliberate redirection instead of absorption, the targeting of Conquest's left arm at every opportunity, the use of the destroyed environment as geometry rather than obstacle. These were not the choices of someone swinging wildly. These were the choices of a soldier who had assessed the problem and identified a methodology. Mark watched his father take a direct hit to the chest that sent him through a concrete pillar, watched him come out of the other side of it moving, already adjusting, already repositioning, and understood something he hadn't let himself understand until right now. Nolan hadn't come back to negotiate, hadn't come back to explain himself, or ask forgiveness, or make a case for anything. He'd come back to stand here, in this specific spot, between his son and whatever was coming. That was the whole plan. Mark stayed where he was. Something in him, some instinct he didn't have language for, said not yet, said let him work. He stayed and he watched, and he held the information about his father carefully, the way you hold something that might break, while 50 meters away the fight continued and the city burned and the traffic light stayed dark. Nolan led with his left, not a committed strike, a probe, fast and shallow, designed to get information about Conquest's current guard position rather than do damage. Conquest's response was to not bother blocking it. He let it land against his cheekbone and didn't move his head. The impact produced a sound like a bat hitting a concrete post. Nolan registered the data, pulled back, adjusted. Conquest's counter came immediately. A straight drive from the shoulder, full extension, the cybernetic arm leading. Not a haymaker. Something more economical than that, and more dangerous for it. Nolan stepped off the line, let it pass his left ear close enough to feel the displaced air, and drove his elbow into the joint where the cybernetic arm met Conquest's shoulder. The joint gave a sound that wasn't quite mechanical and wasn't quite organic. Conquest's arm dropped 2 inches before the servos compensated and brought it back up. Nolan filed that too. Moved. He went low, dropping beneath Conquest's follow-up swing, and drove forward into Conquest's midsection with his shoulder. The impact didn't move Conquest. It was like running into a building. But it got him inside the reach of the cybernetic arm, which was the point. And from inside that reach he drove 3 short hooks into Conquest's ribs. Left side, right side, each one targeting the same 4-inch zone. Not trying to break anything. Trying to make that zone remember. Conquest grabbed him by the back of the neck. The grip was immediate and total. Nolan had a fraction of a second to tuck his chin before Conquest lifted him and threw him. Not a swing, not a spin, just a direct overhead hurl that sent Nolan straight down into the street at full extension. The asphalt cracked in a starburst pattern 3 meters wide. Nolan went into it up to his elbows. He pulled himself out before the dust settled. His vision swam for 1 second, then steadied. He got his feet under him and came up moving, because standing still was how you died. Conquest was already there. He crossed the distance between them faster than someone his size should move and hit Nolan with a 2-handed push. Not a punch, a shove, both palms to Nolan's chest with the full weight of his mass behind it. The force didn't connect the way a punch connects. It transferred, like being hit by a car. Nolan went backward through the facade of a 4-story building, through the first interior wall, through a second, and out the other side into an alley where the wall caught him and the wall lost. He lay in the rubble for 1 breath. 2. Got up. Mark tracked him through the hole in the building. Tracked Conquest moving around the structure's corner rather than through it, not because he couldn't go through it, but because going around was faster from his current angle. The calculation was automatic, unconscious. Conquest had been doing this for thousands of years. His body ran the math without being asked. Nolan was out of the alley before Conquest rounded the corner. He came up from below, used the alley's ground-level debris to push off, went airborne, came over the building's roof and dropped on Conquest from above and behind. He got his right arm across Conquest's throat and his left hand on the back of Conquest's head and pulled. For 2 seconds, he had the leverage. Conquest let it happen. Let Nolan hang on his back with a chokehold applied to a body that didn't need to breathe in any urgent sense, and then he simply bent forward and threw his weight into it. Nolan came over his shoulder, and Conquest caught him mid-rotation and drove him down into the street face first. The street lost. Nolan's face hit the asphalt, and the asphalt opened up around it. He lay still for a moment with his cheek in the crater his face had made, and blood ran from his nose and pooled in the concrete dust, and he pushed himself up anyway. Conquest stood over him, watching. "You're lighter than I expected," Conquest said. Not taunting. Assessing, the way a fighter assesses in the middle of a fight. Processing information, adjusting. "You've been away from active service for too long. You've lost density." He reached down and picked Nolan up by the front of his armor, one hand, the cybernetic one, and lifted him to eye level. "This is what sentiment costs." He threw him again. Different direction this time. North. Nolan went through the air in a low arc and hit the remains of a parking structure at the second-floor level. The collision took out 2 support columns. The floor above sagged. He came down with it, buried briefly under a section of concrete deck that weighed several tons, and was out from under it before Conquest covered the distance. Mark's fists were still closed. His good eye followed his father's trajectory, tracked the dust cloud, waited for movement. Movement came. Nolan pushing up through the debris, getting one knee under himself, then the other, then standing. A gash above his left eye was leaking steadily. Viltrumite healing working on it, but the rate of blood loss outpacing the closure. He wiped it with the back of his hand, looked at Conquest coming. Changed tactics. Instead of moving away from the charge, he grabbed the largest piece of loose debris he could reach, a section of concrete pillar 4 feet long, several hundred kilos, and held it in front of him horizontally, both hands gripping it like a battering ram. Conquest hit it. The pillar section exploded. Concrete became projectile fragments that scattered across a 100-meter radius, punching through what little glass remained in nearby facades, shredding the surface of the street. The force distributed differently than a clean hit, spread across a wider surface area, robbing Conquest's strike of some of its directional efficiency. Not enough to stop him, but enough to change the shape of what happened next. In the half-second of redistribution, Nolan was inside Conquest's guard again. He drove an uppercut into the underside of Conquest's jaw. Not the cleanest strike. Conquest was already adjusting, but it landed and it snapped Conquest's head back 2 inches, and Nolan followed it with a palm strike to the same cybernetic arm joint he'd hit before. The arm dropped 4 inches this time before the servos caught it. Nolan went back to work on the jaw. Left hook, right cross, left hook, not trying to knock Conquest down, trying to make his jaw remember, trying to make the bones in that specific area accumulate damage across the length of the fight. His knuckles were splitting on the third exchange. He didn't stop. Conquest caught his right arm, twisted it past the point of natural rotation. The shoulder dislocated with a wet, meaty sound that carried. Mark heard it from 40 meters away. Something moved in his chest at the sound, something that wasn't quite pain, and wasn't quite anything he had a name for. Nolan didn't make a sound. He let the dislocated arm go slack, used the drop in his shoulder to change his angle, and drove his left elbow into the side of Conquest's head. The impact rocked Conquest sideways. Not far enough, but sideways. Nolan reset his shoulder against the nearest wall, a brutal 2-second process of jamming the joint back into approximate position, and kept moving. His right arm hung lower than the left. His grip on that side was compromised. He adjusted, moved more weight to the left, kept the right arm as a secondary concern. Conquest paused, looked at him with something that was almost curiosity. "Your pain tolerance is intact at least," he said. "That's something." He attacked without warning, no telegraph, no adjustment in his stance, just movement. He covered the ground between them in a direct line and hit Nolan in the chest with the cybernetic arm in a straight drive that didn't have anything indirect about it. Nolan absorbed it. He didn't dodge, didn't redirect. He took the strike full in the chest, both feet leaving the ground, ribs compressing in ways that produced sounds, and he wrapped his arms around Conquest's extended limb before the arm could retract, and held on. Conquest pulled back. Nolan went with him, didn't release, let himself be dragged, used the drag to pull Conquest's balance forward. Conquest compensated, tried to plant his feet, and in the moment his weight was fully committed to the rearward pull, Nolan changed direction and drove himself forward. He drove Conquest's head into the ground. Once, the impact put a crater in the street a foot deep. Twice, the crater became 2 feet. Cracks radiated outward like a spider web, running under the foundations of the nearest buildings. continuing for 30 meters in every direction. Conquest made a sound. Not pain, something more fundamental than pain. The involuntary vocalization of a body that has received a significant input. Nolan released the arm and stepped back, chest heaving. Blood was running freely from the gash above his eye now. His right shoulder was not sitting right. 3 of his ribs had opinions about the hit he'd absorbed. He was not winning this fight. He was making Conquest work for it. Conquest rose from the crater slowly. He reached up and ran his fingers across his jaw on the right side, feeling something there, checking something. He looked at his fingers afterward. Not blood, just assessing what had accumulated. He looked at Nolan with an expression that was different from the one he'd arrived with. Not respect, not fear. Something that lived between fascination and appetite. The expression of a being who has moved through thousands of years of existence without finding anything that required his full attention, and is now, unexpectedly, in the presence of something that might— "You've been holding out," Conquest said. Something in his voice had changed. The careful restraint of a fighter who has been managing his opponent was gone. What was underneath was older and more direct. "You've been fighting smart because you know you can't fight hard. You've been managing me." He rolled his neck. Something popped. "I haven't been managed in a very long time." He looked past Nolan. Just a look. A second, maybe less. His eyes moved from Nolan to the spot where Mark was standing, 40 meters south, watching everything. Then they moved to the building facade 20 meters east of Mark, where Adam Eve was propped against the wall in the ruins of a doorframe, barely conscious, her hand still in her lap. Conquest's expression shifted into something that was almost appreciative. He looked back at Nolan. "I see how it is," he said. Conquest didn't telegraph it. That was the thing Mark would keep coming back to afterward. There was no moment where Conquest's posture changed, no shift in his weight, no preparatory motion that a fast enough eye could have read and reacted to. One moment he was standing in the crater his head had made, looking at Nolan with that new expression. The next moment he was airborne. And he was going up. Not at Nolan. Nolan read it anyway. 2,000 years of reading opponents meant he processed the trajectory before Conquest had completed the first 10 meters of his ascent, saw the angle, extrapolated the descent point, understood. There was a cluster of survivors 60 meters northeast, 8 people, maybe 10, moving through a gap between 2 collapsed structures. They'd been picking their way through that gap for the last 4 minutes, slow progress over unstable ground. A man in the lead using a piece of rebar to test the debris before each step. They hadn't looked up. They didn't know anything was happening above them. Conquest came down at them like a dropped weight. Nolan was already moving. He went northwest first, wrong direction seemingly, using a chunk of standing wall as a launch point, changing his vectors sharply, cutting across Conquest's descent angle rather than chasing it from behind. He got in front. He took the hit. Conquest's full downward momentum, his complete body weight moving at terminal velocity, with intent behind it, connected with Nolan's chest instead of 8 civilians in the rubble field they were standing on. The collision happened in the air, 8 meters above the street, and what came down was both of them together. A single mass of tangled Viltrumite bodies hitting the ground with a force that had nowhere to go but out. The shock wave took the survivors off their feet. Every one of them went down. The man with the rebar, a woman carrying an infant, 3 others whose faces Mark couldn't see from his position. They went down hard onto unstable ground, and the ground shifted under them, and a section of debris cascade started at the far end of the gap. They were alive, bruised, terrified, one of them bleeding from somewhere, alive. Nolan was underneath Conquest, in a crater that was deeper than the last one. Conquest pressed down, both hands flat against Nolan's chest, the cybernetic arm and the organic one, driving his full weight through his palms and into the man beneath him. The concrete under Nolan's back cracked in radiating lines. The crater deepened by another 6 inches. Nolan's arms shook. He had both hands against Conquest's forearms, pushing back, and the geometry was wrong. Conquest above, Nolan below, gravity adding itself to Conquest's side of the equation. Blood ran freely from the gash above his eye into the crater dust. A sound came from his chest that was not the sound a chest should make. He held, barely, his arms shook with the specific vibration of a structural load at its limit. Conquest looked down at him with something that might have been professional satisfaction. "There it is," he said quietly. "That's the ceiling." He released the pressure. Not because Nolan had broken, because releasing it served him better than maintaining it. He came off Nolan in a single motion, was airborne for half a second, and redirected sideways at full speed toward the building facade where Adam Eve was propped in the doorframe. Eve saw him coming. Her hands came up from her lap. Her eyes, which had been distant and turned inward for the last 20 minutes, snapped into focus with the particular clarity that danger produces in people who have learned to respond to it. Pink light gathered at her fingertips. Not a weapon. She didn't have enough left for weapons, but matter manipulation applied defensively, hardening the air in the doorframe into something denser than air had any right to be. The barrier she built was imperfect, rushed. She had maybe 2 seconds, and she used them as well as anyone could. Conquest hit it. The hardened air slowed him. Not stopped. Slowed, redistributed some of the force. Cost him perhaps a third of his momentum. He hit Eve and the doorframe and the wall behind the doorframe, and all of it gave way, and Eve hit the interior wall of the ruined building at a speed that was lower than it would have been and still catastrophically high. She went through the drywall, hit the structural concrete behind it, came to rest in a space that had been a room before the Invincible War, and was now a debris field with a partial ceiling. She did not get back up. Mark was already moving. He hadn't decided to move. The decision and the movement happened simultaneously, the same signal, no gap between them. He saw Eve go through the wall, and his body was crossing the 40 meters between his position and Conquest's before the analytical part of his brain had processed the sequence. He hit Conquest from the left side. The impact was real. He felt it in his wrists, his elbows, his already damaged ribs. The physical feedback of hitting something that weighed what Conquest weighed at the speed Mark was moving. It wasn't enough to move Conquest far, maybe 2 meters, maybe 3. But it moved him, and it turned him, and when Conquest turned, it was toward Mark instead of toward the opening in the wall where Eve had disappeared. "Hey," Mark said. Just that, one syllable. Conquest looked at him. The contempt was back in his face, the expression he'd worn when he first laid eyes on Mark in the ruins, the assessment of something that has already decided what it's looking at and found it insufficient. "The half-breed," he said. "I wondered how long." Mark hit him again. Right side this time, going for the jaw. Not Nolan's patient. A cumulative targeting, just the hardest punch Mark could throw with his left hand, which was the hand on the correct side and the only calculation he was making right now. It landed. Conquest's head moved 2 inches. He caught Mark's left arm before it could retract. His grip closed around Mark's forearm like a vice. "You should have stayed where you were," Conquest said. "I was going to let you watch." He threw Mark into the street. Mark hit the asphalt at an angle, bounced once, skidded. He came up with his palms bleeding from the slide and his vision doing something complicated in his damaged eye and his ribs sending a specific, urgent message about the bounce. He got up, started back. Behind Conquest, Nolan was out of the crater. He'd used the 15 seconds of Conquest's attention being elsewhere to get upright and get moving, and now he was coming in from Conquest's right while Mark approached from the left. The geometry of it was accidental. Neither of them had planned it, but the math it created was immediate and real. Conquest had to be in 2 places. And he was only one thing. He turned to Nolan first. Fastest threat, longest history, the opponent he'd already calibrated. He absorbed Nolan's strike to his damaged right shoulder and delivered a counter to Nolan's midsection that bent him forward. Mark hit Conquest from behind, while his attention was committed forward, both hands, driving into the base of Conquest's neck, all his remaining weight behind it. Conquest stumbled, half a step, one foot moving to catch his balance involuntarily, the body compensating without the mind choosing to. Nolan straightened through the pain from the midsection strike. He drove an elbow into Conquest's jaw on the already targeted right side. The accumulated damage in that area was starting to declare itself. Conquest's response time on that side was a fraction slower than the left, the jaw not tracking the same way it had at the start. Mark swung again, not at the neck this time, at the cybernetic arm's shoulder joint. He'd watched Nolan target it for the last 10 minutes and understood why without being told. He hit the joint twice, fast, before Conquest could reposition. The arm dropped 6 inches. Servos worked to compensate and brought it back up, but the recovery was slower than it had been an hour ago. Conquest drove backward suddenly, not a retreat, a deliberate reversal, using his mass and momentum to bulldoze into whoever was behind him. Mark was behind him. The impact sent Mark into the air for the second time in 3 minutes. He came down harder than the first time. stayed down for a moment, hands on the asphalt, head low, just breathing. His damaged ribs had moved past having opinions and into filing formal complaints. His left eye had joined his right in making the world uncertain at the edges. He pushed up, got one knee under himself. Nolan was in it now, working Conquest's left side since Mark had pulled his attention right. They weren't elegant, hadn't found anything like a rhythm yet, but they were making Conquest divide, and division was something. Conquest couldn't fully commit to either of them without the other landing free strikes, and commitment was how Viltrumites fought. Commitment was what made a Viltrumite strike devastating rather than merely significant. Without full commitment, Conquest's hits were merely significant. He was still winning, still landing more than he received, still operating from a position of fundamental physical superiority. But he was working. He was tracking 2 targets, running 2 calculations, spending energy on the spatial problem of 2 opponents in a way that a single opponent never required. Mark got fully upright and went back in. He caught Conquest across the ear with a right hook. The right hook he didn't have great confidence in because of the rib situation, but the angle demanded it, and he threw it anyway. Conquest didn't go down. Conquest didn't stagger. But Mark felt the impact go somewhere, felt it register in a way that wasn't nothing. Nolan drove a 2-handed strike into Conquest's kidney from the left. Conquest went completely still for 1 second. Then he moved, faster than he'd moved yet, faster than either of them had seen, and drove both hands outward simultaneously, right toward Mark and left toward Nolan. 2 separate impacts at 2 separate targets in a motion that was closer to an explosion than a strike. Mark went north, Nolan went south. The distance between them, when they'd been coordinating, closed to the width of Conquest standing in the middle. Mark hit the ground rolling, came up bleeding from a new place, couldn't identify where, didn't take the time to look. His ears were ringing in a high, steady tone. He looked across the distance at his father. Nolan was upright, slower than before. His right arm was carrying real damage from the shoulder dislocation, the grip on that side visibly reduced. He was breathing harder than he'd been at the start. The gash above his eye had stopped bleeding but left a dried streak of rust red down the left side of his face. He met Mark's eyes for a fraction of a second. Not communication exactly, just the shared acknowledgement of 2 people checking whether the other is still there. Still there. Conquest stood between them. He looked at Mark with an expression that had finally shed its last pretense entirely. What was underneath was older and less abstract. The expression of something that had been doing this for millennia and had just decided to stop being patient about it. "You first, boy," he said. Conquest moved toward Mark. Not running, walking. The specific, unhurried walk of something that has decided the outcome and is simply closing the distance to where the outcome happens. His cybernetic arm hung 2 inches lower than it had at the start of the fight. His jaw carried damage along the right side that hadn't been there an hour ago. Neither of these things changed the walk. Mark set his feet. His body's inventory was not good. The right eye was fully functional now in a technical sense. The swelling had receded marginally, enough to restore most of his field of vision. But the ribs on his left side had graduated from complaint to crisis. And his hands had taken enough impact that the fine motor control in his right grip was unreliable. He was operating at somewhere between a third and half of what he could do on a good day, fighting someone who was currently operating at somewhere between 70 and 80% of what he could do at full capacity. The math was the math. He went anyway. He pushed off hard, going low, trying to get under Conquest's guard and stay inside the reach of the cybernetic arm. Conquest adjusted instantly, dropped his shoulder, changed his angle, met Mark's charge with a knee that caught Mark across the chest, and redirected him sideways without Conquest having to fully commit to anything. Mark hit the ground, rolled, came up, went again. This time he feinted high, a jab at Conquest's jaw that he had no intention of landing, purely to get a reaction, and drove his real strike into the cybernetic arm's shoulder joint as Conquest's guard came up to protect his face. He hit the joint twice in the same place Nolan had been targeting for the last hour, felt something in the mechanism shift under his fist, heard the servos cycle hard to compensate. Conquest's backhand caught him across the temple. The world went sideways. Mark's feet left the ground and he moved horizontally for 10 meters before the ground reintroduced itself. He lay on his back looking at the smoke-colored sky and spent 2 full seconds doing nothing but existing. From somewhere to his left he heard impact, Nolan back in it, pressing Conquest's flank while his attention was on Mark, the two of them trading exchanges at a pace that produced sounds like industrial equipment failing. Mark got up. Nolan's voice came across the space between them, sharp, clipped, the voice he used when he wasn't asking. Mark. Airborne. High left. Mark went. No deliberation. No moment of deciding whether to trust it. Just response. Clean and immediate. His body processing the instruction before his conscious mind had fully parsed it. He was airborne in a second, banking hard to the left, climbing to 30 meters above street level. From up here, he could see the full geometry of it. Conquest below, tracking his ascent, already adjusting his attention back toward Nolan, because Nolan was the closer threat. Nolan pressing that advantage, driving Conquest's focus downward and forward. Mark came down at full speed on Conquest's left side. He hit the cybernetic arm's shoulder joint for the third time in 90 seconds. The impact jarred through his hands up to his elbows, but this time he felt it differently. Felt something in the joint that hadn't been present before, a looseness, a mechanical complaint that the servos were struggling to answer. Conquest spun, grabbed for Mark. Mark went airborne again before the grab closed. Low, Nolan said. Mark dropped, came down at leg level, drove both hands into the back of Conquest's left knee. It wasn't a natural target. Viltrumite knee joints weren't the structural vulnerability they'd be on a human, but the force landed on a joint that was weight-bearing and fully committed, and made it answer for that commitment. Conquest's left leg buckled a quarter inch. Not a fall. Not even close. But a quarter inch. Nolan was already moving through the opening. He drove his left elbow into the right side of Conquest's jaw. The right side. Always the right side, always the same 4 inches of bone, and followed it with his shoulder into Conquest's chest, trying to move him. Couldn't move him. Used the collision to buy a repositioning instead. Mark went up again. Stayed up. Watched from altitude. From up here the pattern was visible in a way it wasn't from ground level. Nolan directing, Mark executing. Nolan keeping Conquest's primary attention, while Mark applied force at the edges, at the joints, at the already damaged points, at the angles Conquest couldn't protect without abandoning something else. It wasn't winning, it was erosion. But erosion was something. Push, Nolan said. Right side. Mark came in from the left, which put him on Conquest's right when he hit, and drove everything he had into Conquest's shoulder, not trying for damage, trying for direction, trying to move him 3 meters to the east. Conquest went 2 meters east. Nolan was waiting at the adjusted position. He'd already moved there before Conquest arrived, already committed to a strike that landed the moment Conquest's weight came into range. The sequence was clean in a way their earlier exchanges hadn't been. Something had clicked between the giving and receiving of the instruction. Good, Nolan said. One word. He was already moving to his next position. Mark banked wide and came around for another angle. From his height he could see the street below. The crater network from the early exchanges, the structural debris, the burn marks where Nolan had gone through walls. He could see the civilians from earlier, the group Conquest had targeted. Still moving through the gap in the collapsed structures, but faster now, almost running, responding to whatever instinct tells people to get away from the sound of ongoing violence. He could see Eve's building, the hole in the wall where she'd gone through. No movement in the opening. He looked away, filed it, came back to the fight. Cover, Nolan said. Mark came down between Nolan and Conquest, not taking the hit Conquest was throwing, just interposing, changing Conquest's targeting calculation for the single second Nolan needed to reposition outside Conquest's current angle of attack. Conquest's strike adjusted to account for Mark's presence, committed to a new line, and Nolan wasn't on that line anymore. Nolan came in from Conquest's back, hit the cybernetic arm joint again, harder this time. Both hands, everything from his shoulders through his fists. The arm dropped fully. The servos cycled and brought it back up over 3 full seconds. 3 seconds was a long time. They used it. Mark high, Nolan low. 4 strikes between them landing on Conquest's torso and head before the arm was functional again. Conquest backed up a step. He stopped himself, looked at his feet, looked at the position he'd backed into. The first real defensive geometry he'd adopted in the entire fight. The first time the space behind him had mattered. He looked between them. Nolan to his south, Mark at altitude above, and to his north. Both of them damaged, both of them breathing hard, both of them still moving. "This is actually impressive," Conquest said. His voice was unchanged, still that same deep, carrying quality, still without the urgency of a man who is concerned about his situation. But something had left it, the hunger for a quick resolution, the certainty that this was already over. What was underneath was older and paying far more attention than it had been an hour ago. Two broken things holding together. He rolled his jaw on the right side, tested it, didn't like what he found. Mark dropped to street level, landing 20 meters north of Conquest, keeping the distance. He was breathing in shallow bursts, his ribs demanding it. His hands were shaking with a fine tremor that had started somewhere in the last 10 minutes, and wasn't stopping. Adrenaline and damage, and the accumulated cost of 3 days of invincible war, followed by this, all of it collecting interest. He looked at his father's back. Nolan was bleeding from the gash above his eye again. Fresh bleeding, the wound reopened sometime in the last exchange. His right arm was carrying real compromise from the shoulder, the elevation lower than the left, the movement slightly delayed. His posture was still straight, still controlled, but the weight was in it now in a way it hadn't been at the start. "You came back," Mark said. He hadn't planned to say it. It arrived in his throat and came out before anything editorial could stop it. Not an accusation, not a question, just the statement of a fact that was too large to keep holding internally. Nolan didn't look at him. His eyes stayed on Conquest, tracking, reading the way Conquest's weight was distributing, calculating what was coming. 4 seconds of nothing. Then, "I'm here." 2 words. He didn't explain them, didn't qualify them, didn't add anything to them that would have made them smaller. Mark looked at his father for 1 more second. Conquest attacked. He came forward without preamble. No escalation of posture, no warning, and he came forward differently than he'd been moving for the last 20 minutes. The tactical patience was gone. The managed, deliberate engagement style was gone. He was through with the methodology that had been giving Nolan and Mark angles to work. He drove straight at Nolan with his full mass committed, accepting whatever he had to absorb from Nolan's guard in order to get his left arm. The cybernetic one, the damaged one, the one that had been dropping under repeated impact, around Nolan's midsection. He got it there, locked it, pulled. Nolan hit him 5 times in the face while the arm was closing. Solid hits, well placed, the right side of Conquest's jaw taking 3 of them. None of it opened to grip. Conquest pivoted and drove Nolan into the ground. Mark was already moving. He came in hard on Conquest's back, both hands driving down onto the back of his neck at the base of the skull. The hardest strike Mark had thrown since this started. Everything left in his legs and hips and shoulders transferred through his locked arms into a single point. Conquest's head went forward. His grip on Nolan loosened by 20%. Not enough. His elbow came back and caught Mark across the chest. A backward strike. Not fully committed, just enough to use. And Mark went back 3 meters and his left leg gave out on the landing, and he went down on 1 knee. He stayed there for a moment, knee on the asphalt, hands on his thighs, breathing in the shallow, negotiated way his ribs were allowing. His body was sending him a message. The message was, "The account is nearly empty." The message was, "I have been doing this since the Invincible War, and I am very nearly done." He looked up. Nolan was up again, somehow. Moving again. Somehow Nolan glanced at him. The same quick check as before. The same fraction of a second assessment of whether Mark was still present and functional. Mark met the look and gave a slight nod that meant, "I'm here," without being able to promise anything more than that. Nolan turned back to Conquest. Mark watched the set of his father's shoulders, watched the way he was favoring the right side, watched the way he positioned himself relative to Conquest's weakened arm, with the patience of someone who has committed to a specific point of failure and is willing to wait as long as it takes to get there. He started to rise. His left leg disagreed about the speed of this process. He rose anyway. Above them, the sky had not improved. The smoke columns were still there, still rising, still going wherever the wind took them over a city that had been having the worst week in its history, and was not yet finished with it. The traffic light was still dark. Conquest was watching Mark get up with the expression that had replaced all his earlier expressions, the one that was no longer interested in Mark's capabilities as a combatant, the one that had made its decision. Conquest didn't change his approach. That was the thing. He didn't signal the shift, didn't alter his rhythm, didn't give Nolan anything new to read. He kept fighting the same way he'd been fighting for the last 10 minutes, pressing Nolan, absorbing what Nolan gave back, managing Mark at the periphery of his attention. The same pattern, the same exchanges. For 40 seconds it looked exactly like what had been happening before. Then it didn't. Nolan drove a left hook into the right side of Conquest's jaw. The accumulated target, the bone that had been taking damage since the third exchange of the fight, and Conquest let it land and did not respond to it. No counter, no repositioning. He absorbed it and kept his eyes on Nolan's midsection and let the hook go past him, like weather. Nolan registered the non-response. Something in his calculation shifted. Conquest's next strike came at Nolan's shoulder, not the cybernetic arm, the organic one. A straight drive that Nolan slipped by moving inside its line, and while Nolan was inside the line, committed to the slip, Conquest simply stopped engaging him. He pivoted. The pivot was complete and total. One moment Nolan was his entire focus. The next moment Nolan didn't exist to him. Mark was 20 meters north, still favoring his left leg, still managing his breathing around the rib situation. He'd read the shift a half second after Nolan did, and a half second was not enough. He moved anyway, went airborne, pulling left, trying to change his position relative to the incoming vector. Conquest's cybernetic arm caught him across the midsection. Not a punch, not a swing, a horizontal drive, the arm moving like a gate closing, catching Mark across the stomach and lower ribs with the full structural weight of the limb behind it. The contact was sudden and total, and the force transferred in a way that was different from being hit by a fist. Mark did not fly backward. He folded. His body answered the impact the way a body answers catastrophic force to the abdomen, by bringing everything inward, by trying to become smaller, by making the shape of someone who has received information they cannot process. His feet left the ground, and he was briefly airborne in a direction that wasn't chosen, and then he wasn't airborne anymore. He hit the street. He lay on his side. His legs were bent at an angle that suggested the fall, rather than anything deliberate. His hands were flat against the asphalt without having been placed there. The impact had not been clean. There was a sliding component, friction taking skin from his palms, before his body came to rest. He was conscious. He was conscious and he was not moving, and the distance between those two states felt very large from inside it. The sky above him was the same bruised gray it had been all morning. A piece of structural debris hung from a building facade 20 meters up, suspended by a wire, turning slowly. He tracked it without meaning to. His vision had not gone dark, which was something. The edges of it were doing complicated things, but the center held. He tried to pull his knees under him. His midsection declined to participate. Nolan's strike landed on the side of Conquest's head in the same moment Mark hit the ground. The follow-through of the motion he'd already committed to, the punch he'd been throwing when Conquest pivoted away. It connected. It moved Conquest's head. Under any other set of circumstances, it would have felt like progress. Nolan did not register it. He was already turning. He crossed the 20 meters without flight, running because running was faster from a stopped position at this distance, and his body knew that without being asked. He covered the ground in 2 seconds and dropped to one knee beside his son. Mark was on his side. Blood at the corners of his mouth. Not a lot, but the specific location of it meant what it meant. His breathing was audible and wrong, the rhythm broken, the depth insufficient. His eyes were open and tracking. He found his father's face. "Dad," he said. That was all. Just the word. Just the one syllable that had been sitting in him for a year, waiting for a moment when it wasn't complicated, and this was not that moment, but it came out anyway. Nolan looked at him. He looked at the blood at the corners of his son's mouth. He looked at the way Mark's torso was moving, or not moving, holding very still around whatever had shifted in there, the body's protective response to damage in the core. He looked at his son's eyes, present, aware, pained. Something in Nolan's chest stopped, not his heart. Something that had been running continuously for 2,000 years, a calculation, a background process, a thing that operated below conscious thought and above pure instinct, the part of him that always knew where his exits were, that always had a reserve held back, a contingency running, an option kept in hand. The soldier's brain, the part that had kept him alive across 20 centuries of warfare by never fully committing, never spending everything, never reaching the bottom of what he had. That part looked at Mark's face and stopped. What it left behind wasn't rage. Rage implied heat, implied a temperature change, implied something that built from a lower state to a higher one. What replaced the soldier's calculation was already at full intensity, and had been since the moment Mark said the one syllable and stopped. It didn't build, it simply was. Like a room you walk into that is already on fire. His son was on the ground. His son was on the ground, and the thing that had put him there was 15 meters away, adjusting its cybernetic arm, and waiting. Nolan placed his hand against the side of Mark's face. One hand, 1 second. He held his son's eyes, checked that they were still present, still focusing, still tracking. And what passed between them in that second was not something that had words in any language Nolan had learned in 2,000 years. He stood up. He did not say anything. There was nothing to say and no part of him that was interested in saying it. He turned toward Conquest, with his hands at his sides and his face carrying an expression that Conquest had not seen on any opponent in the full length of his existence. Conquest had seen rage before. Thousands of times, rage he understood. It was heat and speed and diminished accuracy, a trade of control for force that almost always favored the calmer combatant. He had seen desperation, the cornered, everything-spent attack of a fighter who knows they're losing and throws their last resources at one final exchange. Desperation he had countered 10,000 times. He had seen grief, the particular broken quality of a warrior who has lost something mid-fight and is now fighting with less than they had before. What was on Nolan's face was none of these things. It was the complete absence of self-interest. It was a human being. A Viltrumite, technically, but in this moment the human word was more accurate, who had removed himself from the equation entirely, who was not fighting to survive, who was not fighting to win in any sense that benefited himself, who was operating from a single function that had consumed all other functions and left nothing running alongside it. Conquest opened his mouth. Whatever you're thinking, Nolan was already through the distance between them. He didn't approach. He arrived, the 15 meters ceased to exist in a duration that didn't allow for response, and he hit Conquest with his right arm, the damaged arm. The arm that had been carrying the shoulder dislocation for the last 20 minutes, and he hit him with it without apparent awareness that it was damaged. The impact moved Conquest back a full meter. A full meter, backward. Conquest, who had backed up a quarter-inch under the combined strikes of both of them working in coordination, moved back a full meter from a single hit delivered by one man with a compromised arm. Conquest caught his balance, looked at Nolan, the unease that had flickered across his face earlier. The first one, the small one, came back. It was larger this time. Nolan hit him again. Same arm, same direction, not a technique, not a chosen strike, a repetition of pure output delivered to the closest available point. It landed on Conquest's forearm as he brought it up, drove the arm back into his own face, rocked his head sideways. Nolan closed the distance that the hit had opened and didn't let it reopen. He was inside Conquest's reach before Conquest could extend it, and inside that reach Conquest's size and power became less useful, because force requires distance to build. Conquest drove his knee upward. It caught Nolan in the lower abdomen. A genuine hit, significant force, the kind of strike that had been ending exchanges all morning. Nolan did not adjust his position, did not step back, did not do anything with the information that he'd been hit, except continue forward. He drove his forehead into Conquest's nose. The cartilage gave. Blood came immediately, dark, running down over Conquest's mouth, dripping from his chin. He hadn't bled from his face until this moment in the fight. He threw a counter full extension, the cybernetic arm, everything behind it, and it hit Nolan across the jaw, and the jaw answered for it, and Nolan's head went 45 degrees to the right and came back. Nolan kept his feet. Conquest stared at him. In 4,000 years of warfare, he had hit opponents with that strike and watched them become briefly unconscious while still standing. He had hit opponents with that strike and watched them become briefly unconscious while falling. He had hit one opponent with that strike, one in 4,000 years, and watched them shake it off and keep fighting. Nolan's eyes were fully present, fully on him. There was nothing in them that was negotiating with the hit he'd just taken. There was nothing in them that was doing anything except looking at Conquest. Nolan, Conquest said. The word came out differently than he'd intended. There was something in it that his voice hadn't carried since a very long time ago. He identified it afterward, in the half-second before Nolan moved again, with a clarity that surprised him. It was the beginning of fear. Nolan moved again. He hit him in the same place 4 times. Not the jaw, not the cybernetic arms joint. The center of Conquest's chest, the sternum, the specific point where the ribs converge at the front. The place where force applied correctly becomes force distributed inward rather than outward. Each strike landed in the same 4-inch circle. Each one slightly harder than the last, not because Nolan was escalating deliberately, but because the part of him that managed escalation was no longer running. Conquest blocked the third one, got his forearm across his chest, took the impact on the arm instead. The arm moved back into his sternum anyway. The force was sufficient that the block became a secondary impact rather than a prevention. He threw a counter, right hand the organic one, driving at Nolan's temple. Nolan took it. He turned into it rather than away, reduced the distance so the strike connected closer to the shoulder than the fist, absorbed the reduced force, and used the momentum of Conquest's extended arm to pull himself closer. He was chest to chest with Conquest before the arm could retract, inside every possible angle of attack, and he drove both his elbows alternately into Conquest's ribs. Left side, right side, left side. Not trying to break anything with any individual strike, trying to make the bones understand something through repetition. Conquest got a hand on Nolan's collar and threw him sideways. Nolan hit the street, rolled once, came up running, not away, back. He had not taken a step away from Conquest since Mark went down. Conquest watched him come and felt something he did not have a ready framework for. He had fought beings that were stronger than him, rarely, but it had happened, in the early centuries when the Empire was still establishing its hierarchies. He had fought beings that were faster. He had fought beings with capabilities he'd never encountered, weapons built into their biology, adaptations that created problems he hadn't anticipated. He had never fought someone who simply was not there anymore, someone who had excused themselves from the calculation of their own survival and left only the function behind. There was nothing to read in Nolan's approach, no hesitation to exploit, no self-protective flinch to use as a window, no reserve of energy being managed. A fighter who has reserves holds something back even when they're not aware of it. The body retains options, keeps a small portion of its output available for emergency use. It was an instinct older than conscious thought. Nolan's body had stopped doing this. Every strike was everything. Every exchange spent what was available. He was moving through this fight the way a fire moves through a structure, not choosing what to consume, consuming everything in its path, not asking whether it will have fuel for the next room. He hit Conquest's cybernetic arm joint again. The servos had been responding slower since the last exchange, the response lag growing with each impact. The arm dropped 6 inches. The servos caught it after 3 seconds. Nolan spent those 3 seconds on Conquest's face. Not technical, not placed, just his fists, alternating, driving into whatever was available. Conquest's nose moved under the second hit, not a clean break, but a deviation, something structural giving slightly. His right eye was swelling from the accumulation of strikes to the right side of his jaw. Over the course of the fight, the tissue under it darkening, he looked, for the first time, like something had happened to him. Conquest grabbed Nolan by the throat with his organic hand and lifted. The grip closed completely. Nolan's feet left the ground. His hands came up to Conquest's arm and pulled, not with the goal of breaking the grip. The grip wasn't breakable in any conventional sense, but changing the angle, shifting the geometry of his own suspension so the pressure distributed differently across his windpipe. Conquest drove him down into the street, head first. The impact was enormous. The crater it made was deeper than anything the fight had produced so far. A rough circle a meter across and 18 inches down, the concrete pulverized at the center, cracked in lines extending 10 meters in every direction. Nolan was in the bottom of it, with Conquest's hand still on his throat. Nolan grabbed Conquest's cybernetic arm, both hands, around the shoulder joint where the machined metal met the surgical attachment point, where the connection had been stressed across 4 hours of targeted impact until the tolerances were nothing like their original specifications. He pulled. Conquest felt it immediately, felt the wrongness of the force being applied to that specific point, felt his arm being used against itself, the leverage working at the place where organic tissue met manufactured component, the place designed to flex and seal and never to resist this particular direction of stress. He drove his knee into Nolan's chest to break the grip. Nolan did not release. He drove his knee in again, Harder. Something in Nolan's chest answered the impact with a sound that should have meant the end of physical effort. Nolan pulled harder. The joint gave a sound that was partly mechanical and partly not. A tearing, structural sound with a metallic component, the noise of something being asked to hold past the point its design anticipated, and failing at that request. Conquest screamed. Not from pain in the conventional sense. Viltrumite pain tolerance operated on a scale that made the word almost inapplicable. From surprise, from the profound wrongness of the sensation. From 4,000 years of the arm being part of him, integrated into his physical identity so completely that its removal registered as something more than injury. The arm came away from his shoulder in Nolan's hands. Nolan stood up out of the crater. He looked at the arm for a moment. At the torn mechanical connection at one end, the sophisticated engineering of the component itself, the weight of it in his hands. Then he hit Conquest with it. The metal weight of the arm was substantial, considerably heavier than a conventional weapon, dense with the materials required to make it structurally equivalent to Viltrumite bone. Nolan swung it by the connection end and hit Conquest across the side of the head with the full mass of it. Conquest went sideways. Nolan hit him again before he'd finished going sideways. Same arc, same point of contact, driving Conquest's head down and to the left. Again. The third impact drove Conquest to one knee. Nolan stood over him and brought the arm down directly. No arc, a straight overhead drive into the top of Conquest's skull. The ground under Conquest's knee cracked. Conquest got his remaining hand up, caught the arm on the fourth swing. The impact knocked the arm from Nolan's grip. It skittered across the asphalt and came to rest against a concrete block 30 meters away. Conquest tried to rise. Nolan drove his boot into Conquest's chest. Not a kick, a push, planting his foot and extending, using his legs full length to keep Conquest's weight going backward rather than up. Conquest hit the street on his back. He lay there for a moment. 1 second. 2. Not unconscious. Processing. Running the new calculation with the new information, which included one fewer arm and a skull that had received impacts it was not designed to receive in that number and at that force. He went airborne. Launched himself straight up from flat on his back, a motion that shouldn't have been achievable, pure Viltrumite physical capacity overriding the body's preferences. He went up 40 meters in a second, clearing the battle space, buying the distance he needed to reset. Nolan went up after him. No delay. No pause to reset his own position or assess the vertical transition. He was airborne before Conquest had reached the apex of his ascent, moving up the same column of air, closing the distance before Conquest had expected it to need closing. They met at 30 meters. Conquest had expected to have the reset, expected the standard dynamic of aerial separation, the momentary pause while both combatants adjusted to three-dimensional engagement, the brief window of tactical recalculation that changing altitude usually provided. There was no window. Nolan hit him the moment the distance closed, and kept hitting him while they were both moving, while the altitude was changing, while the geometry of the exchange made clean striking nearly impossible. None of the strikes were clean. All of them landed. They came down together through the top floor of a building that had been compromised by the Invincible War and had not improved since. The floor gave immediately. They went through it, through the floor below, through the one below that, and hit ground level in a cascade of structural material that buried them both briefly under several tons of debris. Conquest came up first. He was bleeding from his right eye, a deep laceration above the brow, the bone beneath it carrying a fracture that was visible in the way his eye tracked. His jaw on the right side had moved from accumulated damage to structural damage. The bite misaligned in a way that would have been agony on any pain scale that applied to him. The socket where his arm had been was torn, the tissue around the connection point ragged. He stood and breathed and assessed. Nolan came up through the debris, 8 meters away. He looked worse than Conquest. Objectively, measurably worse. More blood, more damage to his torso, his right arm still compromised from the shoulder dislocation that had never been properly addressed, new damage from the debris collapse layered over everything that had come before. He looked at Conquest. He took 1 step toward him. Conquest moved back. It was not a decision. It was what his body did when Nolan took the step, and he recognized it with a clarity that was almost academic, the recognition of a thing he had not experienced and had therefore not believed was possible. His body had registered something and responded to it without consulting him. His body was afraid of Nolan Grayson. He stopped himself. planted his feet. 4,000 years of will, overriding 4,000 years of instinct. He stopped moving backward and stood his ground and looked at the thing coming toward him. "You can't sustain this," Conquest said. His voice had changed, not broken, not pleading, but stripped of its former textures, carrying only the words and nothing else. "Your body has limits. You're spending everything. You'll run out before I do." Nolan walked toward him. "This isn't strength," Conquest continued. "This is damage. You're not winning this fight, you're enduring it. When you stop being able to endure..." Nolan reached him. The next exchange was not a fight in any technical sense. Conquest defended. He used his remaining arm, his body positioning, his 4,000 years of combat reflex. He defended, and he landed counter-strikes that would have been decisive in the earlier stages of the fight, that should have been decisive now. Nolan was already at the bottom of his reserves. The counter-strikes landed, and he didn't fall because there was nothing left in him that was tracking the cost. He drove Conquest back across the street, into a wall, through the wall. Into the space beyond it, he drove Conquest's head into the floor of what had been a ground-floor commercial space before the war. Once. The floor cracked. Twice. The crack deepened. A third time. On the third time, Conquest's free hand found Nolan's forearm, and the grip that closed was weaker than any grip Conquest had offered in the fight. Nolan drove his head into the floor a fourth time. The grip released. He stood up. Conquest was on the ground. His remaining arm was at his side. His chest was moving. He was breathing, his body conducting the automatic processes it conducted, but he was not rising. The specific quality of his stillness was the stillness of a body that has delivered everything it has and found it insufficient. He turned his head and found Nolan standing over him. For the first time in the full length of Conquest's existence, the fear arrived completely. Not the beginning of it. Not the anticipation of it. The thing itself, arriving in a being who had not believed himself capable of it, settling into him with a terrible thoroughness. He opened his mouth. Nolan. The words stopped there. Not because Conquest chose to stop it, because Nolan knelt down. And whatever Conquest had been about to say became irrelevant in the way that things become irrelevant when the person you're saying them to has already made their decision, and the decision was made some time ago, and you are simply the last to understand this. Nolan's knees hit the floor on either side of Conquest's chest. He looked at him, not at his face, at him, at the full picture, the damage inventory, the specific geography of what the fight had produced. The arm socket torn and ragged at its edges, the jaw misaligned, the bone beneath it fractured in at least 2 places. The eye, swollen past function on the right side, the brow above it carrying a split that had bled freely down his face and was still seeping. The chest, moving shallowly, Viltrumite lungs capable of operating far below normal parameters, the body conducting its survival functions below the threshold of combat readiness. Conquest could not rise. That was the fact. Not would not, could not. The damage had reached the threshold where even Viltrumite biology required time before the body would answer commands at the level rising required. Nolan understood this. He had fought Viltrumites before. He knew what the threshold looked like. He placed his left hand flat on Conquest's chest, not to hold him down. There was no holding down that needed to be done. Just the placement, positioning, preparation, the hand finding the architecture beneath it. Ribs, sternum, the space between. Conquest's remaining arm moved, slowly, with effort. It found Nolan's left forearm, and the fingers closed around it with a fraction of the grip they'd had at the start of the fight. Not trying to break the hold, not trying to throw him off. Just contact, the arm moving because it was the only thing the body had left that could move. The Empire Conquest started. Nolan's right hand drove through Conquest's sternum. The sternum gave. The ribs on either side of it followed. Not shattering, Viltrumite bone didn't shatter, but bending, compressing. The structural integrity of the chest cavity compromised by a force that entered from the outside and did not stop when it met resistance. Nolan's fist went in past the wrist. He found what he was looking for. He closed his hand around it. Conquest's body responded to this the way any body responds to this. Every system that had been operating below threshold, suddenly running every process available. The organism's deepest architecture recognizing the intrusion and attempting to answer it. His remaining arm, which had been lying at his side with nothing left behind it, contracted hard against Nolan's forearm. His legs moved, his back arched off the floor by 2 inches. None of it changed anything. Nolan's grip tightened. He looked at Conquest's face while he did it. Not as cruelty. There was no cruelty in his expression, no satisfaction, nothing that would have read as pleasure in any language. He looked at Conquest's face the way you look at something you are finishing. With full attention, with the knowledge of what you are doing and the choice to do it completely. Conquest's remaining arm released Nolan's forearm. His legs settled back to the floor. His chest stopped moving. The room was very quiet, the structural debris around them, the dust still settling from their descent through 3 floors of building, the distant sound of fires, all of it present and none of it relevant. Nolan withdrew his hand. He looked at it for a moment. Then he placed both hands on his thighs and stayed where he was, kneeling over Conquest's body, breathing in the shallow, controlled way of someone whose own ribs were asking questions, and did nothing else for a period of time he didn't count. He did not feel triumphant. He did not feel righteous. He felt the specific flatness that comes after a necessary thing, the silence in a person that follows an action that cost everything and returned nothing that could be easily named. The state a soldier arrives at when the mission is complete, and the mission was terrible, and both of those things are equally true. He stood up. It took longer than it should have. His right arm assisted poorly, the shoulders still not seated correctly, the grip on that side unreliable. He got his feet under him and straightened 1 degree at a time, and when he was upright he stood there for a moment without moving. He looked at Conquest. The body had not changed, would not change. Viltrumite biology was extraordinary, but there were specific injuries that even Viltrumite biology could not navigate, and the specific injury Nolan had delivered was one of them. This was a permanent conclusion. There was no recovery, no regeneration, no scenario in which Conquest became a subsequent problem. Nolan turned away from him. He walked, not flew, walked. The distance from where Conquest lay to where Mark had gone down was 40 meters, and he covered it on foot, 1 step after another. And in the time it took to cover those 40 meters, he came back from where he'd been. It happened gradually. The part of him that had stopped when Mark went down, the soldier's brain, the calculation, the self-preservation process, began running again, slowly, incompletely. Like a system rebooting after a hard shutdown, checking its own functions, finding some of them damaged, finding others intact. He was aware of his body again in the way he hadn't been during the last phase of the fight. His right shoulder was genuinely compromised. The joint needed time and rest before it would function properly. 3 ribs on his left side had taken damage that his healing was working through, but hadn't finished. The gash above his eye had closed at some point during the final exchange, the wound knitting while his attention was elsewhere. He had been doing this for 4,000 years. He knew his body's inventory. He knew what was serious and what was time. He reached Mark. His son was in a different position than when he'd left him. He'd moved, gotten 1 arm under himself at some point, shifted from his side to something closer to sitting, his back against a slab of concrete debris. His knees were up. His hands were in his lap. He was watching Nolan approach. Had been watching probably since Nolan turned away from Conquest. The whole walk. Nolan lowered himself to the ground beside him. Not a careful process. His body was past careful, past the energy required to manage a controlled descent. He got close enough and let gravity take the last part of it. He ended up sitting in the rubble next to his son, their shoulders not quite touching. Neither of them spoke. The fires, somewhere to the northeast, were audible. Structural debris settling somewhere in the building they'd come down through. The sound of the city that wasn't a city anymore, continuing its long adjustment to a new shape. Mark was looking at his hands. His palms were abraded from the street, dried blood in the creases of his knuckles, the tremor that had started during the fight still present but finer now. A very slight movement, more vibration than shake. His ribs were doing what Nolan's were doing, asking questions, demanding accounting. "Is it done?" Mark said. It wasn't quite a question. His voice was flat with exhaustion in a way that had nothing to do with emotion and everything to do with the physical cost of the last several hours. "Yes," Nolan said. Mark nodded, looked at his hands for another moment, then looked up at the building facade across the street, the hole where Eve had gone through the dark opening in the wall that hadn't shown movement since. Nolan tracked his son's gaze. Read it. Got back up. The process of rising was not elegant. He made no attempt to make it look like anything other than what it was. A damaged body following instructions from a will that was still operational when most other things weren't. He crossed to the building. The hole in the wall was irregular, the edges carrying the story of Eve's impact, the initial point of contact, the spread of force outward, the secondary damage of her passing through. He stepped through it into the interior space. She was in the room beyond, not where she'd come to rest after the initial impact. She'd moved, marginally, gotten herself propped against the interior wall with her knees drawn up, which meant she'd been conscious enough at some point to want to be against a wall rather than in the middle of the floor. A small thing, it meant something. Her hands were in her lap. Her eyes were closed. Her chest was moving. Nolan crouched beside her, checked her, the specific, practiced assessment of someone who has spent 2,000 years learning to determine what injuries mean and what they don't. Head, neck, the rise and fall of her breathing, the quality of her color, the specific way her body was holding itself. She would recover. Not today, not without time and care. But the fundamental calculus was survivable. He lifted her, carefully. The gentleness of it was not performance. It was just what the situation required, the awareness that she was injured, and that injured things needed to be handled with attention to the injuries. He carried her back through the hole in the wall, through the rubble field, and set her down beside Mark. He sat back down himself. Eve's head was at a slight angle, her breathing steady, her eyes still closed. Mark looked at her face for a long moment, then he reached out and took her hand, just held it, fingers loosely wrapped around hers. The three of them sat in the ruins. Nolan looked at his hands, looked at what was on them, looked at it without flinching and without explanation, and then looked away, out across the destroyed intersection, at the city that was still on fire. He had done a necessary, terrible thing. He was prepared to live with it. He had lived with terrible things before. This one was different in its shape, different in what it had cost and what it had protected. But the living with it was the same. You carried it. You didn't put it down. You kept moving. Somewhere to the southeast, at a distance that suggested something significant but not immediate. Sirens. Not civilian sirens. Something larger. Something coordinated. Multiple vehicles. The specific frequency of heavy response units moving at speed. GDA, Nolan heard it and did not move. He heard it and recognized what it meant. Cecil Stedman, who had been watching this on every sensor available to him, who had been running the math on what to do about Omni-Man returning to Earth and dismantling a Viltrumite enforcer and sitting in the rubble in the aftermath. Cecil, who had resources and authority and very clear opinions about Nolan Grayson. Nolan heard the sirens getting louder and did not move. He sat next to his son and the girl his son loved, in the wreckage of a city that had been having the worst week of its existence, and he waited for what was coming. He was done running. The first vehicles came in from the north, 4 of them heavy transport units, the kind Cecil had started commissioning after the Guardians massacre, built on frames that had no civilian equivalent. Their hulls were thick enough to matter against conventional weapons and thin enough to know they were a gesture rather than a solution against what they were currently approaching. They moved in a loose formation that suggested tactics without committing to them, and they stopped at the edge of the debris field rather than attempting to cross it. The second group came from the east. 3 vehicles, different configuration, lower profile, faster, with external mounting points that were currently occupied. Whatever was mounted on them tracked automatically as they stopped, servos adjusting, targeting systems finding their subject and holding. Nolan heard all of this without turning to look at it. He registered the vehicles, the number, the approximate capability of what they were carrying, and filed it the way he'd been filing tactical information for 2,000 years. Automatic. Backgrounded. He did not move. Mark was watching the vehicles arrive. His eyes moved from formation to formation, reading the deployment the way someone reads a sentence, working out what it meant, what Cecil was communicating by the specific arrangement of force he'd chosen. Not enough to guarantee a result against a healthy Viltrumite. Enough to matter against a depleted one. Cecil always did the math. The vehicles sat for 40 seconds without producing anyone. Cecil making sure everything was in position, making sure every variable he could control was controlled, before he introduced himself to the equation. Then the door of the lead northern vehicle opened, and Cecil Stedman got out. He was wearing a coat that was too heavy for the season, and carrying nothing in his hands. He looked at the debris field between himself and the three figures sitting in the rubble with the expression of a man who has spent his professional life arriving at scenes that were worse than anticipated and has made his peace with this. He walked toward them. Not quickly, not slowly, the pace of someone who has decided exactly how fast this moment should move and is enforcing that decision. He picked his way through the debris with the care of someone watching their footing, and when he'd covered 2/3 of the distance, he stopped. He looked at Conquest's body first. What was visible of it through the hole in the wall of the collapsed building? The stillness, the finality of its position. He looked at it for 3 seconds. Then he looked at Nolan. Omni-Man, Cecil said. 2 syllables. Not a greeting, not an accusation. A statement, I see you. I know what you are. I know what you've done. I know what you were before today, and I know what today adds to that. All of it compressed into the name. Nolan looked at him. Cecil. Mark was still sitting, Eve's hand still in his, watching Cecil approach with an expression that was too exhausted for complexity, but was doing its best. Then Cecil looked back at Nolan. You look like you want to run, Cecil said. The words were flat, not a challenge, a genuine read, or the performance of one. Cecil, observing what he was observing and naming it, putting it on the table between them, seeing what Nolan did with it. A beat. No, Nolan said. Cecil's right hand moved. Not dramatically, just a shift, a repositioning. His fingers moving toward the device on his belt that would signal the weapons on the eastern vehicles to go from tracking to active. The motion was almost reflexive, a professional precaution so ingrained it happened below deliberate thought. He noticed himself doing it, didn't complete it, let his hand settle at his side. You understand what you're standing in the middle of? Cecil said. It was not a question. You understand what I'm authorized to do, what I have more than enough justification to do. Yes, the Guardians. Cecil said it the way you say the name of something that has weight. 7 of them. People I worked with for years. The original team. He paused. Whatever you did today, whatever this is, it doesn't close that account. I know. I want to be very clear about that. Because what you just did, Cecil gestured a small motion that encompassed the crater network, the destroyed buildings, the Viltrumite body visible through the broken wall, is useful to me. I won't pretend it isn't. Earth just got a dead conquest instead of a conquered planet, and those are significantly different outcomes. I'm aware of that. His eyes didn't leave Nolan's face. It doesn't close the account. I'm not asking it to. Cecil studied him. The calculation was visible, not in any specific expression, but in the quality of his attention, the sense of a man processing multiple variables simultaneously, assigning weights, running scenarios. Mark, Cecil said without looking away from Nolan. How are you? I've been better, Mark said. I've also been worse. This week, Eve, alive. She needs a medical team. They're coming. Cecil's eyes stayed on Nolan. Mark, is there anything I should know about what happened here that I don't already know? Mark was quiet for a moment. He came back, Mark said. He was here before Conquest did anything permanent. He stood between me and Conquest for 4 hours. Another pause. He didn't run after. Cecil received this, filed it. Nolan spoke. I know what I owe. He said it the way someone says something they've been working out for a long time and have finally found the exact words for, not rehearsed, but settled. Arrived at, for the Guardians, for what I did to this planet, for what I did to my son. A pause. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking to be held accountable. He held out his wrists. The gesture was almost absurd in its simplicity. A being who had just killed one of the most powerful Viltrumites alive, who had survived 4,000 years of warfare, who could level a city with sustained effort, holding out his wrists, like anyone had cuffs that would mean anything to him. The absurdity was the point, and Cecil understood it. He stood there reading what the gesture actually was. Not a submission to force, because the force available wasn't sufficient. A choice. Voluntary. The gesture of someone who had decided that accountability was where they needed to be, and was communicating that decision in the clearest available language. Cecil looked at Mark. Mark was watching his father. The expression on his face was the expression of someone who has received too much information in too short a period for any of it to be fully processed, and has decided to simply be present while the processing happens over whatever time it takes. Let him surrender, Mark said, not let him go, not forgive him, not release him or excuse him or pretend the account didn't exist. Let him surrender. Cecil heard the distinction. He stood very still for 3 seconds in which nothing happened, and everything was decided. He turned to the vehicles, made a gesture, 2 fingers, specific configuration, the signal his team would recognize. Figures emerged from the northern vehicles, not the armed response personnel. Different team, smaller, moving with the specific purposefulness of people who have been given an unusual task and prepared for it. They were carrying equipment, restraint technology that Cecil had commissioned 18 months ago, when he'd started thinking seriously about scenarios that involved Viltrumites who might, under specific circumstances, be willing to be restrained. He'd told himself he was preparing for an unlikely scenario. He'd been preparing for this one. The team crossed the debris field carefully. They reached Nolan and stopped at a respectful distance, close enough to do their job, far enough to communicate that this was a procedure rather than a confrontation. Nolan looked at the equipment they were carrying, assessed it, made no comment. He held his wrists out further. While they worked, Cecil turned back to Mark, walked the remaining distance, and crouched down. Not a natural posture for him, a deliberate one. Putting himself at eye level, he looked at Mark's face, the damage inventory visible there, then at Eve, then back. "Medical team is 90 seconds out," he said. His voice was different at this range. Still controlled, still Cecil, but something underneath it that was closer to human. "We're going to get you both out of here." "The building she went through," Mark said. "There's debris that needs." "I know. I watched the whole thing, Mark. I have the footage." Cecil paused. "All of it." Mark looked at him. "I know what he did," Cecil said. "For you. For this planet, whether he intended that part or not." He didn't gesture toward Nolan, didn't need to. "It doesn't close the account. I need you to understand I mean that. What he did before today was real, and it stays real." "I know," Mark said. "But I'm not stupid," Cecil continued, quieter. "I know what I'm looking at. I know what it costs to do what he just did. And I know what it costs to do what he's doing now." He stood up. "That goes in the file, too." He turned away, moved back toward Nolan and the team, finishing the restraint process. Nolan looked at Mark. One look. From across the debris field, across the distance Cecil had recrossed, across the 40 meters of ruined intersection that separated them. Everything that was between them, the full weight of it, every complicated layer, was present in the look. The 30 years of lies and the genuine love beneath them. The night in the woods and the flying away after. The crossing of the galaxy in the dark. The 4 hours of standing between his son and an executioner. All of it present in one look, none of it resolvable in the time available. All of it patient enough to wait. Nolan held his son's eyes for a long moment. Then he let the team finish what they were doing. He let his arms be brought together in the restraints. Equipment that was sophisticated and serious, and would hold him as long as he permitted it to hold him. And they both knew this, and it didn't change what the act of permitting meant. Cecil said, "You run, and I will spend every resource this agency has hunting you. We're clear?" Nolan said, "Yes." "Then walk." He walked across the debris field toward the northern vehicles, the team moving with him, and he did not look around at the wreckage of the fight, did not look at the sky, did not look back at the building where Conquest's body lay in the specific stillness of a permanent conclusion. He looked ahead, at the vehicle, at the door being opened, at the interior beyond it. He walked through the door. It closed. Mark watched it close. Eve's hand was still in his. At some point in the last several minutes, her grip had shifted. Her fingers were no longer just resting in his hand, they were holding on. Still unconscious, but holding on. Some function below consciousness doing what her conscious mind would have done if it had been available. Medical personnel were crossing the debris field now, moving fast, carrying equipment, their attention splitting between the two of them. Mark looked at the vehicle a moment longer. Then he looked at Eve. He held her hand and let the medical team come. 6 weeks later, the sky above the facility was the kind of blue that only appears after extended bad weather. Unbroken. Clean. The specific blue of a sky that has nothing in it. Mark had been staring at it for most of the drive. The GDA vehicle that picked him up didn't have windows in the conventional sense. A screen on the interior wall displayed external feeds, which was either a security measure or Cecil's way of controlling what his passengers knew about their route. Or both, which was the most likely answer. Mark had watched the city give way to highway, give way to something that wasn't on any commercial map he could access. And then the screen had gone neutral, and the vehicle had descended. And now he was walking through a corridor that was 60 feet underground and had the specific acoustic quality of spaces that were built to contain something significant. The GDA personnel processing his entry were professional and efficient, and said very little. Cecil had authorized the visit personally. The documentation was in order. The whole thing moved with the smoothness of a system that had been designed in advance for a specific purpose, which was exactly what it was. The door at the end of the final corridor was heavy, not the heaviest thing Mark had ever seen. He'd punched through heavier, but built with intention, built with the knowledge of what it was holding, built with the honesty of an engineer who understood the assignment. It opened. The cell was not what he'd expected, which meant he'd been carrying expectations he hadn't examined. He'd been imagining something punitive, something gray and harsh and explicitly uncomfortable, the physical language of punishment. It wasn't that. It was small, functional. A viewport near the ceiling brought in what passed for natural light through a series of reflective channels, attenuated, indirect, but genuine sunlight. The real thing. A cot, a chair, a surface that served as both table and desk. Books, actual physical books. A stack of them, some open and face down in the manner of someone who reads several things simultaneously. Nolan was sitting in the chair when the door opened. He was already turned toward it, already sitting with the particular stillness of someone who knew someone was coming and had prepared themselves not for the conversation, but for the person. There was a book in his lap. He set it aside. He looked at Mark. Mark walked to the chair on his side of the reinforced partition and sat down. The partition was transparent, a material that wasn't glass and wasn't anything Mark could name, dense and clear, and almost invisible if you didn't look at the edges. He looked at his father through it. They sat with that for a moment. "You look better," Nolan said. 6 weeks of not getting hit helps. Mark's ribs had finished their complaints 4 weeks ago. The eye had been fully functional within 10 days. The healing factor his Viltrumite biology provided was not instantaneous, but it was thorough. "You?" "I'm fine," Nolan said it simply, without the defensiveness of someone protesting too much. Just a fact. He was, as far as he could tell, fine. His shoulder had healed, his ribs had healed, the physical accounting of the fight with Conquest was settled. "They bring me books." Cecil approved a list. Cecil approved a book list. I think he found it amusing. There was something in Nolan's face when he said it that was almost a smile. He came by himself, first week. Sat where you're sitting. Didn't say much. Left after 20 minutes. What did he say? He asked me about Viltrumite command structure, fleet deployment patterns, how Thrag makes decisions. Nolan looked at his hands. I told him everything I know, which is considerable. He looked up. He came back 3 days later with a team of analysts. We've been working through it since, 3 sessions a week. Mark thought about that, about the specific value of 2,000 years of inside knowledge, willingly given, about what Cecil would do with that information and how far it would reach. Earth needed that, Mark said. I know. Nolan paused. It's not why I'm doing it, but I know. Mark looked at his father through the partition, at the lines of him, the specific way he held himself, the economy of his posture, the thing that had always read as distance and now read differently. Not distance, stillness, the stillness of someone who has put something down. You look different, Mark said. Nolan considered this. I feel different. He didn't elaborate immediately. Let it sit. Then, 2,000 years is a long time to be moving. I've been in one place for 6 weeks, and it's the first time in longer than I can accurately remember that I've had nothing to do but think. He looked at the stack of books. And read. Is that good or bad? Both. Nolan's hands rested on his knees. I think about Debbie. I know that's not. I'm not asking you to address it. I'm not asking you to facilitate anything, or carry messages or make decisions about what she should know or when. That's not your responsibility. Nolan looked at his son directly. I just wanted you to know that I think about her, that it's not something I've set aside. She knows you're alive, Mark said. Cecil told her enough. Not everything, but enough. Nolan absorbed that, nodded once, slowly. The fight, Mark said. He said it differently than he'd said everything else. Less conversation, more acknowledgement, moving towards something he'd been working out for 6 weeks. I've been thinking about it, about what you did, about the choice you made when Conquest, when he changed targets. Nolan waited. You could have pressed the attack. When he pivoted toward the civilians, you had an angle. Mark had run it many times. He'd been running it since the second week, when his ribs had healed enough that he could think about something other than breathing. You could have hit him from behind. Done real damage. Instead you— Yes, Nolan said. You took the hit instead. For people you don't know. Yes. Why? Nolan looked at his son for a long moment. Because they were there, he said. Because they'd survived something terrible, and they were trying to get home and something was coming for them, and I was in a position to stop it. He paused. That's it. There's no larger answer. That's the whole answer. You came back, Mark said. I know I said it before. I know I said it during the fight. But I've been sitting with it. Why? He met his father's eyes. You were on Thraxa. You were removed from the situation. You could have— No, Nolan said. I couldn't. Dad, I heard about the war. Intercepted enough to understand what was happening and who was at the center of it. Nolan's voice was even, but there was something beneath the evenness that Mark hadn't heard there before. Something that didn't have armor over it. And I couldn't not come. That's the honest answer. Whatever I told myself about the Empire and my assignment and the life I'd built, when I understood that you were in the middle of something that could kill you, there was no version of me that stayed where I was. He paused. I don't know what that makes me. I know what I did before. I know those things coexist. Yeah, Mark said. They do. The silence between them was large and not uncomfortable. The kind of silence that has earned its size. I don't know what this makes us, Mark said finally. Neither do I. Nolan looked at his son steadily. We have time to figure it out. A pause. If you want to. Mark looked at his father through the partition, at the man who had lied to his face for 17 years and loved him genuinely for every one of them, at the soldier who had killed 7 people he'd called colleagues, and the father who had crossed a galaxy to stand between his son and an executioner, at the Viltrumite agent and the human being, both real, both present, neither one canceling the other out. I'll come back, Mark said. Not an answer to everything, not forgiveness, not absolution, not the resolution of 2,000 years of complicated history into something clean. But not a refusal. Nolan held his son's eyes. Okay, he said. Just that. He didn't reach for more. Mark stood. He stood at the partition for another moment, the length of time it takes to finish something and know it's finished, and then he walked back to the door. Outside the facility, the elevator returned him to the surface in a mechanical silence that lasted 45 seconds. The doors opened. He stepped out into the afternoon. The sky was still that unbroken blue. The sun was in the west now, lower than when he had arrived, the light shifting towards something warmer. A hawk was circling somewhere to the north, riding thermals, moving in long, slow loops that didn't go anywhere in particular. Mark stood outside the door and thought about his father underground, with his books and his analyst sessions, and his stillness that wasn't despair. He thought about what Nolan had said to Cecil's team, about Viltrumite command structure and fleet deployment, and how Thrag made decisions about 2,000 years of operational knowledge being transferred, session by session, into a database that Cecil would use to build contingencies Earth had never had before. Specific contingencies. Informed ones, the kind built from inside knowledge rather than guesswork. The Empire knew Conquest was dead. They knew who had killed him. A Viltrumite warrior who had stood against his own species to protect a human-inhabited world. This was not a scenario their operational doctrine had anticipated. The political complexity of it would take them time to navigate. Not forever, but time. Time was not nothing. Time was, frequently, everything. Earth was not safe. Mark had stopped expecting it to be safe approximately 1 year ago, when his father had put him through a train. Safety was not the condition. The condition was forward, moving through whatever came next with better tools than you'd had before. He had better tools than he'd had before. He looked at the hawk circling to the north, watched it for a moment. Then he reached up and put on his helmet, and the world through the lenses was sharper and wider, and showed him the horizon in all directions simultaneously. He thought about Eve, in her apartment now, 6 weeks into her own recovery, matter manipulation returning to her in increments, her body having its own lengthy conversation about what she'd spent to save him. She'd asked him that morning what Cecil's facility was like. He hadn't been able to explain it yet. He'd tried tonight. He thought about the analysts underground, sitting with his father 3 times a week, learning things that would take years to fully understand and apply. He thought about a father in a cell, reading books, thinking about Debbie, not going anywhere. Not because he couldn't, because he'd chosen this. Because accountability was where he'd decided to be, and the decision was real, and he was living inside it without resentment and without performance. There was a kind of strength in that. Mark was still working out what to call it. He looked at the sky one more time. Clear, unbroken, nothing in it that wasn't supposed to be there. He flew. Let us know what you'd like to see next. The end.